So I'm doing a meta-analysis of all of Omnicom Media Group's econometric models over the years 2011 to 2016. We have a process where we put these into what we call our results vault and then mine them for pieces of wonderful information via meta-analysis. It's like herding cats or pulling teeth or something, but it's really difficult to get really consistent data in because you're comparing things like Heinz baked beans with compare the market quotes and such like. But consistently in our database, we've got media spend in. What does that mean in terms of revenue ROI coming out? So I know that when I'm comparing numbers, I'm comparing like with like, and I want to compare them category by category, which is why I need 30 minutes to do this, because I'm going to show you a few of the category insights that we've got, because it's the answer for what you should be spending on news brands is different category by category, as you would kind of expect. So 3 questions that we're trying to answer was, first of all, how effective are campaigns that use print news brands versus those that don't? Then we had a special section, which was really difficult, and it took us like weeks to do and produce 2 charts, and we've got one of those in the presentation, about digital news brands. So looking at spending on these premium sites, does that have in a contextual, interesting area, does that have a positive impact? And what does that do for the overall print effectiveness? And then finally, we've got some hard answers about what proportion of the budget should be spent on print news brands in different categories to deliver the overall campaign ROI. So not looking just about my ROI is big enough or bigger than that one. It's looking about how do we spend on this channel to potentially get the highest possible campaign ROI. On average, everything will also depend on the content, the strength of the brand, the context and such like, but these are kind of general rules, kind of laws of physics and such like. So the evidence that we've got, first of all, that if we go to item 1, print news brands are boosting overall campaign ROI by 3 times on average compared to those people who aren't using news brands. Digital news brands improve the effectiveness of print, and print news brands make TV twice as effective and online display 4 times as effective. And then finally, we can start to see that when we look at what the spend on print news brands should be, it looks as if it's a return to a couple of years ago. Our data on spend is going up to 2015 in these charts. It should go back to 2013 levels, and you'll see what that means versus 2011 in a little while. So we looked at 6 categories, but you're lucky. Each of these categories could take 15 minutes. We're only going to do 3 of them. First of all, I want to lay the context, and this was one of the things that actually shocked me a little bit when I looked at this data. So we are using SMI data, Standard Media Index data. This is a set of data where media agencies are pooling their data together so that a pooled category spend mix can be reported back, which includes a proper read of online display and of search. So SMI doesn't cover some big media agency groups whose initials start with W and finish with P. And it doesn't include any direct buys or independents. So I believe it's underplaying search and online display a bit, but our other sources, such as Nielsen, don't cover those search at all, and I'm going to say online display properly. So it's a big advance in understanding the core kind of initial metric, like how much is being spent on this medium that an established or a grown-up media channel should be reporting. We have got data across all of the above-the-line media, but we can split down digital spend into display. We can isolate video, and we can isolate search. Separately, we can get access to programmatic spends and mobile spends sometimes, but it's a little bit more murky to get that out of the system. And then we can also isolate news brand, digital news brand data that comes out of the system quite neatly too. So You'll understand what this is in a moment. So this is looking across all of our categories of spend in the UK. The total news brand spend has declined significantly since 2011. So 15.4% back in 2011, down to 9.7%, so about a third off. If we split 2015 into individual channels, then what you can see is that digital channels are accounting for 32% of spend. Within that, we've got some of the online news brands, so we could say that news brands are accounting for 9.7%. We could add magazines and print news brands to get to what print is, that's 11%. And then according to this, you can kind of see that if you split it this way, then we've got our digital channels being significantly large now, and then out of home being bigger than news brands, which did not used to be the case. So we think that there is a pendulum effect and it's swung too far. Now that pendulum really worries me because I think pendulums don't swing that slowly unless they're really, really long and the thing is heavy. And I'm reminded there's a pendulum in the Museum of Science and Industry around the corner, and that goes slowly. Or we could just be in lower gravity. So imagine we're on Mars for that pendulum, okay, because it's swinging a bit too slowly. So across all the categories, the news brand spend has declined. This is just the print news brand, so you can see this has gone from 13.7 to 7.6. So the digital news brand has made up some of the element. This is almost a halving versus the third. If we look at retail, which was actually the really strong channel back in 2011 at 30%, it's gone down to almost half at 16.5%. It's the only category across all of the categories in the UK where news brands is the number 2 channel now. Finance here start off at 13.1% and it goes down to 7.7%. You can see that in all of these, the acceleration of the decline has happened more recently. There he goes again, a Martian pendulum. So we think potentially that acceleration has gone too far. So the exploration that we did, we build in Omnicom Media Group. It's actually a group that's about 30 of them building models of our clients' brands, putting all of this sort of data into a model that explains sales. It's like creating a cake without having a recipe, but these are all the different ingredients we've got, not nearly as exciting as nice free-range eggs and chocolate and such like, but they are the different components that drive sales. And I know, looking at all of these, that things like pricing, things like product and distribution are hugely more important than the advertising. But the advertising is one of those few things that you have under your control. You can turn it off and on. Whereas pricing, you're often being dictated to by the retailers, distribution, you're paying the retailers to get it, etc. And so having things that you can control is as important as to be able to look at the other things. So these models, we bake cakes and we try to understand exactly what the relative sizes of the contributions of these individual factors are via multiple regression. And what we do is we create pictures of sales and then we decompose them into colours of different advertising and marketing effects. So in this chart you can see some layers of distribution effects, you can see some spikes of crack cocaine promotions, you can see the individual advertising channels having an impact on this particular brand. And so we get that column which is called sales due to spend. That comes from our modelling work. We know how much we've spent, or you hope that we know how much we've spent. And then you divide one by t'other and you've got a revenue ROI. It's as simple as that. So getting to a chart like this takes about 8 weeks and costs a client about £40,000, but it kind of tells them the answer to their media planning for the most recent campaigns, because everything could change in the future. So we analyse those ROI numbers, and we do that via meta-analysis, which is starting to then look at our individual cakes and saying, well, was that cake better? Did that have free-range eggs rather than cheap eggs in it, or did it have demerara sugar rather than castor sugar and such like, to try and understand the differences and the similarities between the cakes, working out whether we should always put 2 eggs in or is 3 better to put in. That's what we do. And then what we do is we take all of those data points in our results vault and we start to analyse across each of the campaigns. So on this chart, we've got each of those dots represents a model that's been built for a brand in a category. And we're plotting out the revenue ROI that we've measured from the model versus how much the print news brands were as a percentage of the total communications spend. And then we fit a line. Actually, we get Excel to give us an automatic fit to the line, which is why it's given us a funny shaped one rather than a sensible shaped one. And then we can start to see that those dots are quite close to the line. It suggests that as you spend more, you get more ROI. So that if this was a real chart, which it's not quite, this would tell you that we should be spending more money, a higher percentage on print news brands, and would get a higher overall campaign ROI. However, once we get all of these dots, they start to turn into pictures of Dalmatians and all sorts of join the dot tricks. So what we do is we reduce it into tertiles. I just picked up an email saying, what do you call it when you've got 9 things? Because Wikipedia doesn't tell me. It jumps from 7, which is sextile, to 10, which must be decile. And it's obviously a nonile. If you know your Latin, you know that. So that's what I sent back. Obviously, it's a nonile. But then my phone wouldn't accept nonile because it's not a word. It kept correcting it, so I had to put it in quotes. There you go. So creating those tertile cases, we've got exactly the same dots. We break them into 3 groups on the x-axis, and then we say what the average is of each of the groups, and you've got the bars at the bottom. So get used to some bars because we're going to have some coming up now. So we're looking at how effective are campaigns that use print news brands versus those that don't. And we're going to look at retail, which is purple. And what we've got here is our 3 tertiles for print news brands being used as a percentage of the total campaign spend in retail. We've also got an ROI for the campaign for those retailers who are not using print. And what you can see is that the people who don't use print have an average ROI of 908. And then all of our people who spend on print news brands have got a higher ROI. In fact, the typical spend level is in that low group. It's towards the top of the low group, it's about 16.5%. But you can see immediately that according to our data, that we're saying that if that group could spend a bit more, get into the medium group, go above 20%, so the median of that group will be about 25%, they'd get a £25 ROI. So the 2.8 times number that you see over on the left, that is the difference between the no print and the highest bar in that graph. So you can see how that's come from. When typically people who are using print, because you'd be really quite daft not to, you'll be moving from the low to the medium. Okay, so we've got used to this with retail. Look at the same thing for finance, and you can see there's a very marked difference. The people who aren't using print news brands have got a very low ROI, and then the best spend is within the medium group, again at 7 to 22%, and that is where people are spending at the lower end. But you could automatically see that this would give you some guidance or some support as a media planner to say, okay, let's put print into the media schedule, but let's do it up to around 10% or something like that to try to persuade people. You've got some evidence to back that up now. The other thing that we look at within our models is to be able to look at how long advertising works for. So in the short-term society, we are used to things just working straight away. But actually one of the real benefits of established media, and video is particularly good at this, TV is good at this, is to be able to get people to remember it and act on it later. And that tail of advertising effect is having a really strong effect in terms of your overall effect. If you only measure things in the short term, you're cutting off a lot of the effect. And a lot of that effect is, you can imagine it as people changing their brand perceptions of the brand, and then potentially being triggered by another, potentially a short-term short-term advertising channel or something like that to actually then purchase. So it's a really complicated element, but we can look at the overall effect of that using ad stock in our campaigns. So when you've got a set of GRPs like we have in the blue, you can see what happens when we've got a 30% carryover per a week. It goes up as you spend, and then as soon as you stop, it will drop off, so that if you had 100, it would go down to 30, it would go down to 9, it would go down to 2.7, and then I'm starting to not be able to multiply again. And then with 80, it goes from 80 to 64 to 51, etc., etc. So it's much slower, and you can see that tail. And in fact, these things never finish, but they just go to very small numbers. So 80% is very typical of a long-term branding message, and it's typical of a established and heavyweight TV campaign. And 30% per week is typical of a shorter-term promotional message. What we're finding is that when we're comparing, and here I'm comparing directly newspapers, print news brands versus online advertising, so particularly online display. And we're seeing that print news brands are having, and this is finance, it's green. If you're colourblind, these charts really don't work for you. Print is working with a much longer tail. People are remembering the stuff that's in there, whereas the online is having only a very short-term effect. So the difference between day 7 is actually a staggering 391%. In retail, there's a smaller difference here, but we're still seeing a 9% higher impact at day 7, and that will probably lead to something like a 9% higher ROI in the longer term. So you can see that it's really worthwhile. So when we look at each of our individual categories, these are our carryover rates, the percentage by which we carry over rather than decay. The decay is 100 minus this. We like to talk positive numbers. And then online, you can see the big difference in finance that caused that 391%, and the others, there is a difference between each of these different elements. So very quickly on the digital news brands, which is an area that we're trying to work with Denise to try to get some really detailed case studies, because this involves, if you're trying to do it in an econometric model, splitting your online display data into your digital news brands versus other premium sites versus other online display. It's messy to do, and nobody does it because it's too time consuming to do, but hopefully we'll get some evidence coming out of this directly soon. And what we did discover was that, particularly looking in retail, that if you add the digital news brand activity to the print, it improves that print revenue by up to 5 times in the retail sector. So it really does have a very positive multiplier once you're adding in that digital news brand. It's all those media planners not reading the newspapers. Now we're starting to look at how, and Peter did a bit of this, at how using print news brands, how does that help other media work hard? So rather than total campaign ROI, we're looking at the TV revenue ROI on the y-axis now. And so we've got the people who aren't spending on print news brands but are spending on TV, delivering a £6.49. People who are only spending a bit on print and are spending on TV get even lower ROI. And then as soon as you get to spending above 10% on your print, then your TV ROI is starting to really get nice and high. And actually this says perhaps you shouldn't spend more than 12% on print across all of services. because there seems to be a kind of point of diminishing returns where actually you'll be better off spending on another media channel, which might not be TV, it could be online display or search or whatever. We can see the same kind of halo effect, but it's an even bigger effect that when we look at online display on the y-axis. So here what we're seeing is that people who don't spend on print news brand have an average revenue ROI of 12.46 on online display. As soon as you start spending on print, then you start to have a higher ROI for your online display revenue ROI. Your long-term, your brand building, your established media activity makes your short-term work harder. If you try to evaluate it via some sort of digital attribution or something like that, you won't be able to spot it because it's not in your data set. But our sort of analysis pulls out those effects. It does suggest that if you spend more than 12% on print, you get a very large, much larger effect on that. So that could be amazing to try to test and validate. And here we're looking at the same online display ROI, but for print news brands. And here what we get is a slightly different picture. Here, no print news brand, we've got online display with a 484. What we're suggesting here as a result of the analysis, that spending between 2 and 10% on print in finance would be the best thing to potentially really get your online display revenue going. Spending too much and you won't have... You lose some of the effect. Still much better than not spending on it at all. And then revenue, radio revenue as a final one. Just looking at this, we got again a very kind of interesting picture looking at this high tertile to be able to see that if you can spend money on print and above 22%, you get a significantly higher. Actually, it's above 7%, really, isn't it? If I was to put my purist things on, in terms of the samples that we've got, there's not a huge amount of difference between those two medium and high final numbers. But you can certainly see the benefits of spending over 7% in print in terms of driving your radio revenue. And this is looking at the same picture in finance, and this is saying again that over 7% is your sweet spot. Actually, if you're going to spend less than 7% in print, that's going to have a very poor effect on your radio revenue. You're not going to. You may as well have spent it on something else. So then we get to our final section. There's going to be a test on this later, by the way. About what the proportion of the budget should be that's spent on print news brands. So from all of the different analysis that is done across all of these different categories, we create sets of sales response curves for our optimizing systems, and this is an example from a category. And because it's for a kind of automatic online optimizing system, you can't say no one ever spends £80 million on online display. You have to give it a curve, and then separately you can put a constraint on it and say no one in their right minds would spend more than this much money. So that online display curve has been measured at about 0 maybe to 5 million or something like that, and then it's been extrapolated. And so that's why it scares people when you see that, because the extrapolation is how the curve was starting to look, but we don't know. It's just been extrapolated from a curve. What you can see is a typical pattern that almost every channel, you spend up to a certain point and then it stops working. It hits diminishing returns. It flatlines. TV is the one kind of soaring through the channel, and there we have seen media investments spending up to 80 million. I think this might be grocery retail, and we're looking at annual spends. And so TV, we're pretty sure that curve is right, and then you can see some of the other curves right down at the bottom. They're really steep when you're spending quite little amounts of money, but extra frequency doesn't deliver against for those media channels. Anyway, so we use these curves, and they're a little bit of common sense to be able to put some constraints on. The recommendations I'm going to show you, I haven't put any constraints on. I just thought I'm going to leave it going free rein, because the print curves in here are actually quite reasonable. So, and that's what we're focusing on. So when we look at grocery retail, what we're seeing here is the total annual campaign budget along the x-axis, and then what should be the optimum be for print news brands as we go through those different spend levels per year. And you can see if you're spending less than 5 million on news brands, we're saying don't spend anything on print, potentially £5 million a year. You're probably going into local radio and a lot of maybe some online. And the mix of what else is going to be on is, we have that data, but I'm not going to show you that. And so what you can see is that we can see a huge proportion of the mix should be going into print, talking about maybe over 20% at all reasonable levels in terms of grocery retailer. So when you look at this category, a typical spend for a retailer would be about 40 million. Grocery retail, and you've got some biggies who are spending over 80 million. In 2015, that supermarket trolley is moving very slowly, isn't it? You get very frustrated in Waitrose if they went that slow. The percentage in 2015 was 16.5%, and what we're saying is for £40 million on the previous chart should be at 27% to give you the maximum campaign effect. Now we're looking at the other bits of retail. So this would be your high street retail and your DIY shops and whatever. Spending much less. On average, they're spending about £8 million across all different retailers. There'll be some regional and smaller chains in there as well as the biggies. And you can see again that we're seeing, as we get to respectable levels of spend, we're seeing over 20% should be going in. And if we look at the same picture for finance brands, different thing here. So actually, if you're spending only £5 million for finance, you should be put a lot of your money into print, because it's not going to cut through the clutter, particularly on TV, when you've got black horses cantering through forests and such like, spending not quite £100 million, but significant amounts of money each year. So, and you can see that even at very large spends, we should be putting over 10% into print news brands. So a typical finance brand is spending £25 million. Typical amount being spent on print in 2015 is 8%, and it really should be up at 21%. This is a category which has gone a little bit online crazy. So our Martian pendulum, we do think, has swung too far. Apologies, I shouldn't do that. And what we're saying is that we should really be going back to look at regaining some spend share for news brands, and we should be going back ideally to that 2013 level, not the heady days of 2011 where retail was at 30% of the mix. Times have moved on. We've got other access to other channels now, but yes, it should definitely be going back to that sort of level. The pendulum isn't swinging, Denise.
No, I don't know why on that one.
No. There you go. Blame the technicians, not you. So our evidence is that, first of all, print news brands are boosting overall campaign ROI by 3 times on average. If you average across the categories, the difference between the no and the highest tertile is 3. Then we're finding that print news brands are making our other big channels work much more effectively. So TV twice as effective and online display 4 times as effective. And so looking across this, we're seeing that spend on print news brands really should return to higher levels than they are. That money's been taken out too much from news brands, and we think potentially go back to 2013 levels, and then potentially also add in some digital news brands as well, and you'll get even better returns coming back from the data. And hence we get to the slogan you've got on your goodie bags, which is about boosting your campaign ROI 3 times on average. I think there's going to be a tune takeout that you could give by category, which is what you would get for people who are spending on print, what they should be spending in terms of print. And Newsworks have built some really clever ready reckoners and tools on their website so that you can look at individual categories and get some insights. And also, I believe there's more data. There's the other data that I didn't have time to go through today to be able to show you. So thank you very much for paying attention.